We're now recording.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from. This is the monthly Roundtable Breakfast, co-sponsored by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I'm Maria Volpe. I am a professor at John Jay, where I also direct the dispute resolution program. I started these breakfasts after 9/11 as a way to bring us all together in person. And we met in person at John Jay until March 2020. Starting April 2020, we began experimenting with the online version, and we have continued since then. These breakfasts are recorded, and the recordings are posted on two websites, www.acr-gny.org and www.jjay.cony.edu/dispute resolution. Each month, these breakfasts are pulled together by a wonderful team I'm a part of, including Julie Denny, Nikki Borofsky, Matthew Latimer, Emily Skinner, and Chloe Choi. It takes a village every month to put these breakfasts together. I was looking up during the informal chat time the future speakers. I'll just give you a list of the ones that we have confirmed. July 6th will be Peter Phillips from New York Law. August 3rd, Cynthia May from Atlanta, who'll be talking about millennials and conflict resolution. September 7th, Dan Burstein, who'll talk about ways to not discriminate in our processes. We're working on October 5th. November 2nd is Susan Potziba, who is from the Massachusetts area, and we'll talk about some of her public policy work. Today, we are so delighted to have with us Joshua Flax from the Federal Mediation Conciliation Service. Josh, we're so really delighted that you're able to join us to talk about your impressive work. We got to Josh through Peter Coleman, who everyone who's been on previous breakfasts has heard speak a number of times here, but Peter's been working on a model called adaptive mediation, which is something that Josh is going to put some flesh on for us. You know, this is the blending of theory and practice. We often talk about how do we do that in this field. You know, in many ways, the field is old, but we're also very new, and we're still trying to figure out these new models and new approaches and what works where. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julie Denny, who is going to formally introduce Josh. Take it away, Julie.
Thanks, Maria. You covered most of it. Josh is currently the Deputy Director of Policy and Strategy at FMCS, also known as Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. He, in this capacity, has recently served as the lead mediator for the multi-year resource management plan public policy negotiations in Washington State for 17 Native American tribes, multiple state agencies, and multiple federal agencies. That's an armful. I don't know how you discriminate between them or distinguish between them. He's going to talk to us about a particular case that involved multiple parties, and I'm just going to turn it over to Josh to talk to you all.
Thank you very much, Julie and Maria. You guys hearing me all right?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and jump right in. For those of you who are mediators, we got a particularly juicy mediation case study today. And I'm going to review all the twists and turns for you. But first of all, a huge thank you to the New York chapter of the Association for Conflict Resolution for having me today. And also to my friend Peter Coleman for suggesting that we come together. So that's really great. I will dive right in and you can let me know if you're seeing my slides.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm currently Deputy Director for Policy and Strategy at Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service. Unfortunately, with this case, I don't have too much time to talk about FMCS today, but during the Q&A at the end, I welcome your questions about FMCS. And also, I'm going to share with you after the talk today all my slides. So you'll have everything, including my contact information. And there's a couple pauses here, places for Q&A midstream as well. This case study is about mediation of the largest federal government to Native American negotiations pretty much in a generation, certainly pre-pandemic. It's something that I've talked about regularly. I talk with associations, with graduate students, with many others who learn together in the negotiation conflict resolution space, like you guys. So you can treat today's talk as a case study of mediation of highly complex, multi-party, high-stakes negotiations with an added dash of the adaptive mediation model. And so that's basically what we're going to do here today. So in order to properly ground you, I need to talk a little bit about negotiated rulemaking and tribal self-governance. So today's case is about mediation of the Tribal Transportation Self-Governance Program negotiations, September 2018 to June 2020. And inevitably, especially as a Fed, it's known as TTSGP. So you'll see two important themes recurring throughout. And this one I ask at the top of the slide, what does it mean to negotiate with a government, at least in this context? And also the other theme is about the challenges posed by the massive complexities that abound when federal to stakeholder negotiations are concerned. And we're going to jump right into that. Those complexities are awesome, and I'm intending the original meaning of that word, inspiring of awe, due to their breadth and their complexity. So I'll introduce you really briefly to negotiated rulemaking and tribal self-governance, and then we'll jump right into the case of TTSGP, which is an example of both attempted simultaneously and initially with disastrous results. So where to begin? Negotiated rulemaking, a grand feature of American democracy that no one has ever heard of. Although I suspect with this group, I've got the best shot at finding a few folks who have. I'll ask Nikki to do me a favor and post a quick poll in the chat, because I'm curious who has. Thank you, Nikki. And I'll go up to the link, I think, and actually, I'll just ask Nikki. Nikki, can you check that for me? Oh, there we go. It popped right up.
Nobody has answered the poll yet, but if you can't click on the, oh, no, now we've got some action. But I also popped the question, do you know what negotiated rulemaking is? And now we've got some participants on the survey.
Okay. So good. All right. So it's like it's a good place for us to start. Okay. So what is negotiated rulemaking? Well, first we just got to ask ourselves, what is traditional rulemaking? Rulemaking is, as simply put, how the apparatus of the US government takes the laws written and passed by Congress and implements them. So Congress passes a law, and that law will include specific instructions for one or more federal agencies, or departments, as we frequently call them, on the parameters of the new law. And so it's up to the department in question to figure out how to implement the law, what mechanically needs to happen for implementation. And when that law creates a new federal program or significantly adjusts an existing program, the department named in the law will write a rule. And that rule contains all of the tens or hundreds or thousands of details of the program, right? And at the federal level, these things get pretty complex. And all of those details have to fall within the parameters of the law that Congress already passed. So the law will also contain specific statutory authority, which grants the department in question the authority to implement the law. And what that specifically means, again, almost mechanically, the rule that the department writes to implement carries the full weight of law with it. So because we're talking about the federal context, the rules written apply to the entire country. So it's crucial for the department to get the rule right. So as an example or two examples, think of rules written by the EPA about car tailpipe emissions, right? So that's done by a rule, by rulemaking, or light bulb standards rules by the Department of Energy, right? And now we've all got these LEDs. That's a result of a rulemaking that actually FMCS participated in, but we'll get to that. So those light bulb standards rules by the Department of Energy, and you get the idea. Congress passes a law that requires all bulbs manufactured in the United States to meet a minimum energy efficiency standard. And then the US Department of Energy writes a rule to tell manufacturers and consumers what that law really means when they go to build or buy that light bulb. So now you have a sense of how this rulemaking works. For decades, rules written by various departments were routinely litigated, causing endless delay. And an easy example there, we all know, is the large number of EPA, Environmental Protection Agency rules, written in the 1970s and 80s, right, shortly after President Nixon created that agency, to restrict the use of various chemicals and hazardous to the environment. These rules were litigated into the 1980s, into the 1990s, right? The famous one with W.R. Grace made it into a film with John Travolta called A Civil Action. So it's not uncommon for this type of litigation to cause a full decade of delay. And that makes it difficult for the federal government to implement new policies, sometimes impossible, right? So theoretically, the law is going to be implemented, but that's not always the case, and due to the litigation. So starting in the mid to late 1980s, some departments started experimenting with negotiated rulemaking, which takes the exact opposite approach from the original, right? So 180-degree shift. In negotiated rulemaking, before the department writes the rule, they convene a large stakeholder society, and they bring those stakeholder negotiators to the table with the department's federal negotiators, and the large group will write the rule together by conducting hundreds of smaller negotiations along the way over every single detail of the rule. And so this is the difference here, right? So Congress will instruct the department to use the negotiated style. If the negotiating body successfully completes its work, a final rule is published. Now the law written by Congress can be implemented, and the whole process from the start to the publication of the final rule, as it's called, can take up to 2 years and sometimes longer. And that's assuming there's no complete breakdown of negotiations, and that will be the subject of the case study today. So the interesting thing about the negotiated style is that legal challenges tend to be batted away by the courts. So generally speaking, at this moment in time, most departments consider the negotiated rulemaking process to be the preferred route. And so Congress actually paid attention to the experimental negotiated rulemakings in the 1980s, and in 1990 passed the Negotiated Rulemaking Act, and specifying that this multi-party consensus-building negotiation approach to rulemaking would be the preferred route government-wide for departments to implement new laws. The act further required, and so they wrote Federal Mediation Conciliation Service into the act. So that requires FMCS, the agency I work for, to provide the full scope of training, facilitation, and/or mediation, if needed, of these processes to the departments and stakeholders involved. The negotiated style of rulemaking is gaining in popularity across the federal government, and there's no mystery as to why. The more gridlocked Congress is, the less our legislators are able to negotiate the details themselves. The news this week notwithstanding, that's the trend. And it's become easier for Congress to kind of draw those wide boundary markers and leave the details to the implementing agencies. So, and I'll ask for Nikki's help in seeing hands if I can't see them. Just a quick pause here. Any questions about negotiated rulemaking?
There was a question from Harvey if Congress reviews the rules.
That's a really interesting question. They tend not to, but if anything, in the rulemaking process is overseen by the department in question, by their lawyers all the way through. So the review is kind of ongoing, and the department is not going to agree to anything, even proposed by members of the public, stakeholder negotiators. The government won't agree to anything that the agency in question thinks is not in keeping with the statute. And that's because of this legal authority that's conferred on the department in question to write the rule, so that the rule carries the full weight of law. So this is, in the crudest example, this is Congress giving, for example, the EPA the ability to regulate these hazardous chemicals or what's going into our water or our air. Now, for many decades, perhaps until recently, the EPA interpreted that broadly, and they write rules that carry the full weight of that law, of the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera. Great question.
I think that's all the questions for the moment.
Okay, so the other key piece of information that you need for this case is about what's called tribal self-governance. So today's case study is a direct result of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, inevitably known as ISDA, of 1975, passed by Congress. For those who are not familiar with this important space, the federal trust responsibility to Native Americans stems, of course, from hundreds of years of slaughter, land theft, and other injustice committed by the federal government against Native Americans. So for over 100 years, right up to the present moment, this trust responsibility requires the federal government to provide and pay for a full range of services to tribal members, including tribal members on tribal lands. And this extends to education, healthcare, housing, land and wildlife management, transportation infrastructure, judiciary, and much, much more. Same things that the federal government funds across the rest of the country. So ISDA, Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, requires federal agencies, where practicable, to allow for self-governance tribes to receive the federal program funds directly, rather than having a federal agency provide the service. So, and I'll explain what that means with an example, but this basically enables eligible tribes to administer and implement their own programs using the same federal funds as would have been expended if the federal agency responsible ran those programs. So we can say here, without being glib, there's a good chance for mutual gain, right? The tribes will gain self-governance ability and increased independence and autonomy, and the federal agency involved can simply write a check, transfer the responsibility for the program administration to the receiving tribe, and have them run it. So here's an example. Imagine if the Indian Health Service is planning to build and operate a new $300 million clinic, medical clinic on an Indian reservation. The tribe in question will apply to the IHS, Indian Health Service Self-Governance Program, meet the eligibility criteria and demonstrate that. And then the Indian Health Service will send the $300 million to the tribe. The tribe will independently build and operate their own healthcare facility, and they'll report back to IHS how they spent the money. So there's quite, and I know this is not sort of known to the general public, but it's a really interesting feature of the federal tribal relationship. And it turns out over the recent decades that it's been very successful. So prior self-governance, successful self-governance negotiated rulemakings of note right? And these self-governance programs are usually initiated with a negotiated rulemaking. So that was why it's crucial you guys understand what that is, as will the case study today. And prior successful ones extend to tribal judiciary, education, wildlife management, the environment, and involve all of the departments that you see on the screen. Department of the Interior, many different bureaus there, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Indian Health Service, etc. So there's quite a lot of progression of what they call ISDA, right? And this sketches kind of the path. It started with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Indian Health Service, kind of like a test run back in the 70s to develop these self-governance programs. By the time, all the way up to this case study in 2015, that was Congress directing the US Department of Transportation to use negotiated rulemaking to develop and implement a tribal self-governance program. So we're going to jump into the case study momentarily, and I'll pause for a question. If you want to read more about this, these are folks actually that I studied with, like Joe Kalt, an economist at the Kennedy School, and Eric Henson is a longtime friend and collaborator and colleague of mine. And he's also Native American, and he's written extensively about tribal self-governance. So before we jump into this case study, just wanted to pause. Any questions about tribal self-governance?
I don't see any hands up or people jumping into the chat.
Okay, on to mediation of the TTSGP. So Tribal Transportation Self-Governance Program, negotiated rulemaking in this tribal self-governance space, which is to say, highly complex operating environment even before negotiations began. So just to ground you really fast, the United States Department of Transportation includes household names, right? Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Railroad Administration, coming into, they've been in the news a lot, not just for recent rail disasters, but also the near rail strike right before Christmas, as you'll recall. The Federal Transit Administration, the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Maritime Administration, many more, 19 sub-agencies in all. Okay, and this is an organization where the FY23 budget appropriation was $105 billion. So this is one of the largest arms of the federal government, of the whole government, after defense and health, pension, social welfare programs. So just to take one sub-agency, Federal Aviation has 35,000 employees all by itself, including about 15,000 air traffic controllers. So due to the size of the agency in question and the funds involved for transportation infrastructure, TTSGP, we believe, is the largest such negotiated rulemaking for tribal self-governance to date, potentially involving billions of dollars per year that the federal government would spend with self-governance tribes if they could figure out how to negotiate the rule together. How to negotiate that deal between the sprawling bureaucracy and 574 federally recognized Indian tribes is our topic today. Worse, how do you mediate that if these negotiations fail as they did? So grounding in the case, many invested stakeholders, the United States Congress, through the Fix America's Surface Transportation Act of 2015. So sharp readers of the Times and other publications will remember that was the last major infrastructure package before the one that passed more recently. So they usually do them in 6-year tranches. The United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, all 574 federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States, United States Department of the Interior Self-Governance Advisory Committee, Department of Interior Bureau of Indian Affairs, Health and Human Services, Indian Health Service, Tribal Self-Governance Advisory Committee. The list goes on and on. The specific negotiating parties, 26 negotiators named by the US Department of Transportation Secretary of Transportation at that time in 2016. 6 of the negotiators represented the DOT and the US Department of Interior, including the Bureau of Indian Affairs. 18 negotiators were tribal leaders. So that is a little bit interesting how the federal government at the front end of this thing tried to recognize that the tribal contingent of negotiators needed to be larger. All negotiators brought huge teams of attorneys, advocates, political advisors, etc., to every set of full plenary negotiation meetings, which were usually multi-day affairs. And the goal, negotiate every single detail of a brand new self-governance program for Native Americans. And this would be the first comprehensive tribal self-governance program at the USDOT. They did eventually achieve their goal. The rule is now published. It is 113 pages long, mostly single-spaced, and it was published on June 1st, 2020, but not before the total collapse of negotiations, huge heartache on all sides, and then their very tentative arrival at federal mediation. So this is the true story of those negotiations and the mediation process that brought those negotiators and stakeholders back together. And on a quick note, more typically, US federal mediators are forbidden to discuss their work in such detail due to the sanctity of the private caucus, as you well know, among other reasons. Here, these negotiations and the bulk of the mediation outside of private caucus, they took place in full sunlight. So I can give you the full story, and I can answer your questions too. And here's how these negotiations went. The FAST Act, like on your screen, included those provisions instructing DOT, you're going to develop and implement a tribal self-governance program, and you're going to use negotiated rulemaking in order to do so. So the DOT complied. Negotiations for TTSGP began right after the passage of the FAST Act. It was passed in December of 2015, I was told, and proceeded without mediation for 2.5 years. I was told the Department of Transportation started the process very early in 2016, so they got right to work. They opened the negotiated rulemaking process early 2016. They solicited applications they just put it out publicly. They say, okay, all 574 federally recognized tribes, anybody who wants to come and be considered to be a tribal negotiator for the TTSGP negotiating committee can apply. So they receive lots of applications. They can't pick everybody. So the applications go to the office of the secretary. They go right to the top. The 18 negotiators plus some alternates are approved and seated. The full slate of tribal negotiators, as well as the federal negotiators, as mentioned, 18 tribal negotiators, 4 alternates, as well as those federal negotiators. The tribal negotiators were from tribal DOTs, right? So for example, Navajo Nation is 3 times the size of Massachusetts. They have their own Department of Transportation. So they sent a negotiator. And in some cases, tribal government elected officials were the negotiators. And think back to the time period, 2016 into 2017. So even with the change in presidential administration in early 2017, the new secretary, those of you who are sharp observers have already said her name in your mind, was Elaine Chao, who was a really experienced federal operator. So new DOT Secretary Chao supported TTSGP negotiations and negotiators and just continued the process unchanged through the remainder of 2017. But by early 2018, the Trump administration was kind of taking hold. Secretary Chao showed up. The DOT negotiators received new instructions, and they were instructed to present an entirely rewritten version of the rule that differed significantly from the draft that was previously being negotiated. So all that progress was negated. The negotiations quickly fell apart. That was February 2018. In June 2018, the tribal and federal negotiators came together one more time in plenary negotiations. And they asked the department, are you sticking with your draft, or are you going to go back to the one that we were working on together? And the federal negotiator said, unfortunately, we've received instructions, probably right from the top. We're sticking with our draft. We don't want to use the version that the parties were working on together. So the tribal negotiators made a signal, and they all stood up and they walked out. And in Indian country, as they say, that's called a tribal walkout of the negotiations. And in July 2018, the tribal negotiators wrote to the United States Senate Committee on Indian Affairs and insisted that federal mediation be retained for mediation of the TTSGP negotiations. DOT really didn't want to do that, but once the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs had spoken, they kind of had no choice. So DOT reached out to FMCS in August of 2018, and I took the case. I assembled my team, and we started work that September. And we prepared endlessly for the first set of plenary negotiation sessions, which were the last 3 days of October of 2018 and the first day of November. I missed taking my kid trick-or-treating is why I remember it. And the negotiations were in Washington, D.C. Our prep focused, the mediation team's prep focused on a broad, single-minded strategy to hit the reset button on these negotiations using a mediation process. These parties had been negotiating for 2 years already. They clearly needed a different approach. We mulled over all kinds of ideas for the meetings, for the mediation design, and we eventually developed a tactical approach, and we felt good about it. Okay, so negotiation day arrived. The United States DOT was hosting the talks at the mothership in Washington, D.C. And this, by the way, is a very imposing edifice with extraordinary security. So we walked into the plenary negotiating room 30 minutes early, and that was instead of 60 minutes early because we were detained at security, and it turned out that we had to be escorted around the buildings. So that was sorted out. They were a little slow off the mark at DOT, but they found our escort and we got it going. We walked in the room 30 minutes early. What do we see? 75 to 100 people just milling about, talking loudly, chit-chatting, competing for seats at the main table. Mediators looked at each other. We realized our strategy was desperately incomplete. There were tribal negotiators, DOT negotiators, presidential appointees, lawyers, lobbyists, technical experts, endless numbers of low-level civil servants and members of the public, because these are done in full sunlight. Everybody chit-chatting and trying to kind of score a great seat at the main table. So that was extremely disorganized from the beginning. We were able to call the meeting to order from the head table and everybody finally sat down, but that looked like the musical chairs moment when the music stops, because we had tribal negotiators and others who couldn't get a seat at the main table. And so I thought, geez, that was a terribly inauspicious beginning to this mediation. As is customary in tribal meetings, the negotiations opened with a prayer in a native tongue. So everybody stood, mediators, everybody in the room, 75 to 100 people, and we stood and bowed our heads, and I thought, okay, this entire room did one thing together well. That's probably a good start. But then we were advised that the tribal co-chairs of the negotiating committee, so the two tribal leaders of the tribal delegation, needed to make a statement. And they surely did for at least 30 minutes each, mostly filled with accusations that the department was failing to negotiate in good faith, right? And remember what they'd been through from 2016 all the way through to this moment in later 2018. Other tribal negotiators joined the speakers list and they did exactly the same thing. People were really upset. Finally, the presidential appointee representing the US Department of Transportation, not the secretary at a lower level, but one of the deputy undersecretaries. So in the government world, somebody high up. He joined the speakers list and he responded, and he was respectful and he was optimistic. And I thought, okay, we're getting somewhere. I signaled, we have complicated kind of hand signals and stuff that we can do non-verbally as a mediation team. I signaled to the mediation team that we're ready. We're going to move the group toward an interest-based discussion on some of the substantive items in dispute. And I stood up and I was about to announce the next phase of the meeting, right? We're going to make this process move. 20 more people raised their hands to join the speakers list, and that was that. We heard nothing but speech making all the way through the coffee break and right up to lunch. And this is day one. So the mediation team was in a state of high anxiety during lunch when we huddled. And it was clear to us these negotiations would persist just as they had for 2.5 failed years if we didn't do something drastic. And then mediation would be a failure before we even got started. We needed to establish the mediation team as an unequivocally grounding presence to carefully manage and oversee all process moves and process decisions so that the parties could focus on the substance of the negotiations themselves. So what did we do? Well, here's what we did after lunch and over the next several days. And I'll also add in some of the moves that the mediation team made, borrowing from this really helpful, more recent model developed by my friend Peter Coleman, mentioned earlier, and his colleagues at Columbia University, and they call it adaptive mediation. So the first thing we did was to establish mediators' control over the room by controlling the seats, only named negotiators at the main table. And it sounds minute and kind of uh, overly sort of school teacher-ish. Okay, you sit there, you sit there. But the reality is that in order to get those lawyers and lobbyists away from negotiations, we had to make a rule. Only named negotiators, right? So those 18 tribal and 6 federal, only named negotiators at the main table. That's it. Nobody else, not even off to the side. So lawyers and technical advisors sit in the first few rows of the gallery, and then all the staffers sit behind them. And after that, the general public. And this move was not broadly popular by the mediators, but the named negotiators themselves were really supportive because they got to keep their seats at the table. So we eliminated with this process move the lawyers and others' ability to constantly whisper in their clients' ears, right? So they would have to advise their clients during breaks or by text message, which of course is exactly what they did. But with this move, we elevated the named negotiators and invited them to almost like step away from their coterie of aides, right, and form them into a new group of their own, a group that would be wholly focused on reaching agreement during the mediation. Next move, separate the people from the problem. We needed to tamp down the finger pointing and refocus on the substantive issues to be negotiated. There were at least 22 big topic headings with multiple subtopics under each one, hundreds of issues to be negotiated. So on day 2, we introduced the group to an electronic flip chart they could each access from their own device. So they were able to anonymously contribute ideas. And in this case, it was their answer to the mediation team's question, which topic should we negotiate first, second, third? And once those electronic flip charts were all populated with everybody's ideas, we projected them on a big screen, and we used that to stimulate a directed and facilitated conversation and debate, controlled by the mediators, to remind the group that eventually we had to move beyond talking about talking and actually start negotiating the topics on the screen. And the third key process move, build a smaller group, a new group of negotiators to get the bulk of the nitpicky work done away from the main table. And that process move was the hardest of all, harder than getting people to let us control the seats. So we ran our own kind of organizing campaign off to the side. The mediation team did, and we used, and this is pre-pandemic, we used private caucuses, one-on-ones, water cooler chit-chat, coffee bar chit-chat, and meetings. Remember when that was possible, to introduce the idea that the negotiating committee, the big committee, was too big to make meaningful progress. And this was building off of the painfully obvious fact at the front of everyone's minds that negotiations as usual had already failed. So by the time we got to day 4, this is again just that very first plenary, October to November 2018, day 4 in Washington, D.C., when the mediation team requested kind of almost the permission of the large group to help us assemble a subcommittee and invest it with the power to discuss substantive matters. Our work was successful there, it was fruitful, everybody agreed. And the large group negotiated everything about that subcommittee, how large, who, when, where, and eventually agreed to let the mediators convene that subcommittee. We later named it the Drafters Subcommittee, and that consisted of 3 attorneys from the department, 3 tribal attorneys, and 1 named negotiator from each side. So out of that big group of 24 named negotiators, we reduced it to 2, and we allowed them their 3 attorneys each. So we went from 26 total down to 8, big progress. And we co-opted a few attorneys from both sides. We kind of picked them and we sort of said, we think you should take those drafters subcommittee seats. And we picked the most troublesome ones from that first week. They would laugh if they heard that. We picked them because they would cause less trouble to the process if they were a part of it, if they were on that subcommittee. And the mediators were empowered by the large group to convene that subcommittee anytime we wanted to, right after that big plenary concluded, and that's exactly what we did. The key move to build more trust in that subcommittee concept was a physical one. The drafters would meet in subcommittee only at federal mediation headquarters in Washington, D.C. And they would agree to meet nowhere else. And the tribal negotiators had some comfort with that. And as it turned out, we never negotiated anything back at the US DOT headquarters again. Big sigh of relief. So in conjunction with the drafters subcommittee, we also limited these full plenary negotiations. They had been doing them frequently. We only committed to one more plenary negotiation after day 4, November 1st, 2018, and that became the second plenary mediation session 4 days in March 2019 in Shawnee, Oklahoma, in the heart of what they call Indian country. So let's look at the adaptive mediation model and kind of weave that in for a little bit here. By this point, our mediation team had made 3 important adaptations. The first, assuming the role of the medic, because we found the parties in extreme crisis and the mediation medics treat an urgent situation. Mediation required urgent directive action to lessen the intensity. So for example, literally assigning seats and somehow getting everyone to go along with that. But then we had to adapt again quickly to become what the model calls referees. And this means we use task focus to establish the key thing the referee does, right? Establish the level playing field to begin to rebuild trust in the negotiation process. And that required yet another adaptation right after that. We became fixers, right? So we built new tools for them to use to get the mediation back on track. And we did that by introducing that electronic flip charting tool, which helped streamline issue identification and prioritization. And so now and I'm just looking at the clock, okay, we're good. I wanna make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A. So now the mediation team left Washington on November 2nd with some goodies in our pockets. And by that, I mean commitments, right? We had the agreement to allow subcommittee work with specific protocols for communication, transparency, diplomacy, and a commitment to a second round of plenary mediation meetings. And we didn't squander those commitments, we ran with them. The mediation team convened the drafters group right away at Federal Mediation Headquarters for a full week in January 2019. That's a 5-day week, not a travel on Monday, travel out Friday, and another full week in February 2019. And all of those were to prepare for in-person plenary in Shawnee, Oklahoma in March 2019. And looking back at our adaptive mediation model, drafters group, drafters subcommittee, mediators adapted yet again to become what the model describes as counselors. And that means we created a safe space for small group negotiators to dive deeply into policy problems and also to share openly about why those problems mattered using both qualitative and quantitative examples. So lots and lots of anecdotes about what happens in what they called Indian country or on tribal lands and reservations out there, of the struggle that Native Americans had when there's a physical lack of transportation infrastructure, like forget even actual roads, no guardrails, no stop signs, that school bus trips that go on dirt roads, that take an hour to go 15 miles because the roads are so poor. Over the course of this 12-month period, the mediation team walked the parties carefully through the whole mediation process. And this is why I find the adaptive mediation model so powerful, right? We adjusted so quickly from medic to referee to fixer to counselor in any direction that we believed helpful to move the talks forward. Of course, we also coached and cajoled and consulted and facilitated and managed lots and lots of hats to breed success here for the mediation team. And in all, the look and feel of this process ended up, we moved it back to kind of felt like a more typical negotiated rulemaking or any large scale public policy negotiation, separate private meetings, private caucus with the tribal side, with the DOT side, carefully managed large plenary sessions, and also handling of inevitable speed bumps in the road where we needed to pivot and reboot sometimes, most notably, again, for those careful observers who remember, through a 35-day government shutdown in December of 2018. And that was hard for our group because we had just gotten started with them a few months earlier. They began to trust in the mediators, and then we were prohibited from doing work, right? As you probably know, when there's an official government shutdown, the federal employees, the entire federal workforce, not including the Department of Defense, are not allowed to go to work. So the mediators also really, I felt good about my team. They helped the parties. The mediators grew so much, and they helped the parties learn how to message and communicate and function more effectively at the table, all while establishing and maintaining this level playing field. If you want to look at it another way, it's almost like the mediation team, we kind of became the secretariat for the whole thing, right, to keep the whole thing on the rails. At those March 2019 meetings in Oklahoma, we made a lot of progress, and especially with the next key process move, we got the group to the large group to give more formal delegating powers from the big main table down to the drafters. And this would enable us to help the group move even faster. So we had the main table be very explicit, call the drafters in, give them instructions, and specifically delineate those additional abilities to negotiate what we called, and those of you in the labor management world will know this, we call them TAs, tentative agreements. Away from the main table, they could negotiate them in drafters, as long as the drafters promised that every TA was brought back for approval at the main table. And so the full spread of 24 named negotiators were comfortable with that approach. So we had already made, in my mind at that time, remarkable progress. So we wasted no time. We reconvened drafters for another full week in April of that year, another full week in May of that year, and that set up a mediation team recommendation to the entire assembly, obviously by email at that point, but with phone calls to prepare for it. We recommended a new round of full plenary negotiations with the mediators, of course, June of 2019. And this time we were moving it to a new hosting tribe, Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community in Scottsdale, Arizona. Truly beautiful spot. If you've never been there, I highly recommend it. And that was a really successful week of negotiations. The drafters would present the TAs and they would be adjusted a little bit by the big body of negotiators. And then by the end of that week, it was done. Not the final rule, the draft rule. So the draft rule was complete and it was published publicly in a place called the Federal Register. I won't bore you with that today, but the draft rule was published for public comment in October of 2019. Now comes, and we're nearly through the case, now comes tribal consultation. Meet the stakeholders in person. In the federal negotiated rulemaking world, every draft negotiated rule, all of them, 100% of the time, has to go through a public comment process. And it's referred to as that, public comment, for various reasons stemming from the sovereign government to sovereign government relationship when dealing with tribal negotiations. Public comment has a new name, a specific name. It's called tribal consultation. The federal government is consulting with the other sovereigns. So off I flew to the National Conference of the Congress of the American Indian, is what the organization is called. And that year, the national meeting was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and later to a smaller group meeting of same in Choctaw, Mississippi. And my job was to assist federal and tribal negotiators as they presented the draft negotiated rule in tribal consultation. And any tribal members, any members of the public could show up to those meetings and ask questions and say, okay, what is this new self-governance program going to do for us, for me? And they could also suggest adjustments. So they had a 113-page draft that they could read and prepare for tribal consultation meetings. I sent other members of the mediation team to other meetings around the country. Tribal consultation happened everywhere, in person, but largely more toward the West, where more tribes are concentrated than in the East. So after several months and many, many meetings, tribal consultation was completed by December 2019. And of course, in this federal negotiated rulemaking universe, now what has to happen? Well, the whole negotiating body has to come back together again to negotiate what they call the final rule. And of course, the mediators would be there for 100% of this. They weren't doing anything without us. So we used the same process as before, but this time, with such high levels of trust in the mediation process that we had worked really hard to establish, the negotiators were comfortable kind of giving the drafters group to the mediators. And so we didn't have to meet in plenary first to kick off the final rule negotiations, we met in the small group, in the drafters group first, and we would worry about plenary later. So we hosted the drafters again, actually by Zoom. Federal Mediation was a user of Zoom long before pandemic. And then we dragged them to Washington in person, back to Federal Mediation HQ. The drafters came for an entire week in February 2020. And now you start to have a sense of what was going on in the world at that time. And with that work on the final rule in February 2020, we were ready for a grand final plenary negotiation session of the entire traveling roadshow, all negotiators, all advocates, lobbyists, lawyers, everybody. And so we convened. March 2020, plenary negotiations convened in person, first week of March. And the hosting tribe was the Morongo Band of Mission Indians in Cabazon, California, at their resort conference center there. March 1st, 2020, I flew to Palm Springs with the mediation team, even while already wondering about the reports of the novel coronavirus possibly already circulating in California, particularly Southern California. But in any event, all the negotiators arrived and they were in a great mood. They were jovial. That feeling persisted throughout the week. Mediation had been successful. They were going to finish the final rule, and they did late on the night of March 5th, 2020. And from the grandstanding and recriminations of October 2018, we achieved a massive round of basically hugging. I think every single negotiator hugged every other negotiator 3 times to celebrate the achievement. It was tremendous. In retrospect, that could not at all have been helpful preventing viral transmission. And then we all flew home the next day. So over the next 2 months, I heard from everybody involved by phone, email, Zoom meeting, tribal negotiators, DOT negotiators, technical advisors, attorneys, all the other personnel involved contacted the mediators. They were elated at what they had achieved. A consensus agreement on the largest new federal spending program in Indian country in a generation. And the final consensus rule was published in the Federal Register June 1st, 2020, and the program officially launched October 1st of that year. And I have just 2 concluding notes before Q&A. So with these TTSGP negotiations, at that time, the very largest tribal federal negotiations in a generation, this meant respect the sovereign government to sovereign government relationship and keep it in mind at all times. So for what did that mean for the mediators? We had to kind of keep our diplomat hats on throughout, because even though we were the mediation team, we're also feds. So we're representing the US federal government in the sovereign to sovereign relationship. So this included building in time at plenary and other meetings for tribal rituals during negotiations, such as prayers in native languages, formal introductions of external tribal leaders who visited the negotiations to give speeches, and crucially, strict attention to protocol at the table, particularly by the mediators, such as who gets to speak first. I'm not embarrassed to say I learned that the hard way. It was not me. The most senior tribal leader in the room, also the negotiating committee's co-chair, he always spoke first, 100% of the time. By the end of the process, the mediation team really had transformed ourselves into what felt like this secretariat function of a mini UN kind of a setting. And so my last note concerns the tribal co-chair of the TTSGP negotiating committee, head councilman Joe Garcia of the OK Owinge Pueblo of New Mexico, a longtime tribal leader for his people, an Air Force veteran. So Joe walked on this May 11th, 2023, and I would like to dedicate this talk to his memory. He was a tireless advocate for Native rights, and he was also a peacemaker. And he became my colleague and friend during this process. And it was Joe who taught me that he always gets to speak first. I feel strongly he is grinning just now as the last words belong to him. And I welcome your questions on any aspect of this.
Thank you so much. I wanted to start while everybody gathers themselves for hopefully some live questions. I wanted to just pop in a few of the text questions that came in. One was, what was the size of the mediation team? You said there were 24 named negotiators, but what was the size of the mediation team?
Really great question. We started with 3, in October, November 2018. And one of my colleagues on the team said something during a moment of extreme frustration. He sounded a little overly directive on something he was discussing with the group. And so, tribal leaders called me the following week by phone, by cell phone, and said that that mediator was no longer acceptable. So we were down to two. We were acceptable, and that feeling among the parties grew, which was wonderful. It also meant that really that should have been a 3 or 4 person team to manage something that size. So it was a lot of work for the 2 remaining mediators. So that was me and an extremely talented longtime colleague of mine named Moira Caruso. She's up here in New England as well, in Rhode Island, and she has a specialty in mediating what we call now public policy negotiated rulemaking. So any massive government to stakeholder negotiations at the federal or other level. I realize I should probably, to accompany this, just offer you a quick slide, and you guys will get all of these. And I think you're looking at my slide. This is what it looked like, by the way, when they published the final rule, June 1st, 2020. You can see the date there, and all the parties needed some political cover. So unusually, they don't normally do this. They talked about the mediation process itself, including referencing federal mediation. Usually we're more in the background, but everybody kind of needed that in this one. And so this just breaks down at Federal Mediation Conciliation Service, all the stuff we do, everything. So you guys know we were originally founded to mediate large scale, high stakes collective bargaining conflict in the private sector, but you can see the missions grew over time. So Moira, as an example, she focuses her practice mainly in box 2. And in fact, she was just in Boston the other week doing some work with our other friend, Susan Podziba, who was just mentioned. So Susan is a practitioner in the negotiated rulemaking space as well, and a longtime friend and colleague. And you guys will have all of this, including my full contact info in the packet.
So there are a couple of other questions that I want to just combine and synthesize into one. And that is, what was the process, if any, of communication and thought that went into before the first plenary meeting? Was there, consideration given to sitting in circle as opposed to a head table, audience type of situation? Were there any documents that were, transferred? And if how, and if there were, how was that done? And was there preparation in writing, and any of the kind of particularities that were interesting to you about that process?
Thank you, Nikki, for relaying the question. I have a very specific answer. No, none of that critically important prep happened because the US DOT was trying to wriggle out of mediation all the way through until November 1st, even during the beginning of negotiations. I won't mention anybody by name, but I will sound uncharacteristically uncharitable for me. The DOT was a real pain in the butt. They did not want to be forced into mediation. And you guys know how it is as mediators. It's better when it's voluntary. But in this case, when the US Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, I think Mitt Romney, for example, was sitting on the committee at that time, when it says you go to mediation, well, then the department has to comply. So they stonewalled us. They didn't return phone calls. They didn't return emails. They did everything they could to make our lives difficult. They showed up 30 minutes late to escort us, literally, physically, through the building to the conference center. They refused to engage with us on room design, room selection, seating design, microphones, LCD projectors, you name it. They just ignored us completely. I will add some additional color commentary to the story. At the end of day 1, just as the mediators were figuring out how to kind of wrap our heads and our arms around this thing, after the conclusion of negotiations on day 1, we were summoned to the upper floors, to the executive level of the US DOT. We weren't told anything. One person was sent to bring us from the plenary room. We were greeting and saying goodbye to negotiators, federal and tribal. So when, thanking them, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8:30, whatever it is. We were instructed to grab our briefcases and such, our equipment, and head upstairs. No warning, no explanation, nothing. And we're escorted into a completely square conference room with a completely square table. And around the table, every single seat was taken. And around the walls, every single seat was taken except for the last 3 seats next to the door, 3 chairs. And they point to us and they sit down there. So along the line of the feds from the DOT, all the way to the last three chairs, and then there's me, and then Moira and another colleague. We'll just call him Max. So me and Moira and Max are sitting there, in the last three chairs, and the US DOT spent an entire hour haranguing us. Every person in the room spoke. They went around the table, every person around the table spoke, and then they transitioned to the group around the outer wall seats. Every single person spoke, and every single person told us that we were crap at our jobs, that mediation was a waste of time, that they didn't want to be there, that they questioned our legitimacy, they questioned our credibility, they questioned our professionalism, questioned our skill, questioned our credibility, questioned the reputation of the agency. They tried to say they didn't know us. They tried to say that the three mediators sitting in front of them had bad reputations. So this went on for an entire hour. So finally, the head person, the political appointee, looks at me and he says, "What do you have to say for yourself?" And I'm looking at Max. Now, Max has been working with me for 20 plus years, and he's got his fists balled by his side, and he's twice my dimension in every regard, and his face is all red, and he's about to get out of his chair and hit somebody. But he knows me really well. We've worked together in just these kind of situations, and I think he had a sense that I knew what to do there. So the top political in the room says, "Okay, what do you guys have to say for yourself?" The answer was easy. And you guys know this as mediators. I said, "You know what? I think you're all right. I don't think we're the right people for this job. And I have no problem saying so. It's been clear. You have made the case amply. Every person in the room has spoken. This isn't gonna work." And so Moira and Max knew to watch for my signal. We all three stood up in unison and we walked out. And somebody ran after us and said, "Wait a minute, where are you going?" I said, "Well, I mean, the meeting was extraordinarily clear. You guys didn't mince words. This isn't going to work. At federal mediation, first and foremost, we strongly believe in not wasting people's time. That is a cornerstone of our practice. And people don't want their time wasted. We don't want to waste taxpayer dollars on something that's not going to work. We're taking off." And the guy, I'll leave him nameless, the political, was a little bit panicked, and he kind of turned white. He said, "Well, what the hell am I going to do here?" I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, we'll sit outside for 15 minutes and why don't you talk to your group and think about what you want to do." So they left us outside for 90 minutes. It's 7:30 at night or whatever by this point, and they call us back in and they said they wanted to try the mediation process. We said, "Okay, thanks for letting us know. Good luck." We shook everybody's hand, every single person's hand, and we wished them a good evening. Anyway,
Wow.
thanks for that question about preparation. That's how, now you know the full understory. That's how this thing got started.
And I think just dovetailing a little bit on your response, there was a question about if there were ever any disagreements between the, now we know 3-2 mediator team, and how you dealt with any differences of opinion between yourselves, or were you kind of know how to work together and in sync?
Oh gosh, no, an absolutely wonderful question. Here's how we do it. There's a really straight answer. Me and Moira and Max go in a room off to the side and we yell at each other, and then eventually we figure it out. Sometimes we do raise our voices. It's much more collegial than that, but we absolutely had internal disagreements at critical inflection points all the time. And sometimes we actually tell the parties, "Okay, thank you for this," or suggesting that, or we tell each other, "Okay, we need to sort something out at the next coffee break." Or we ask for patience on the part of all the parties to say, "Okay, some really interesting things have been raised. The mediators need some time to plan your process design, and we're gonna at the next coffee break, we're gonna go do that in another room." Earlier in my career, Max and I were longtime friends and colleagues. Max and I would sometimes yell at each other. When Moira joined our team for various practices, she she kind of directed traffic, and she would tell us to both sit down and shut up and let's do our process meetings and figure it out. Always friendly in the end. But the mediators, and you guys know this, sometimes you do have a really strong, powerful feeling about what you need to do next, and your buddy on the mediation team does not agree, and so you got to work it out.
There was another question, a little bit more technical, earlier on, about if you were able to comment on the differences between the original rules and the changes that Elaine Chu brought. Are you able to speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, generically, the details of these negotiations at every version of the draft, whether the original one worked on, the one presented by the DOT that destroyed the negotiations, and then the one that was finally negotiated, um, all of those are about control, and it's about the money. One thing I really learned that is really powerful about the DOT, and you may not be aware of this, apart from specific functionality like providing air traffic controllers, for example, and some other very select functions, really the DOT is just populated by accountants, lawyers, and actuaries. And it's mainly about giving money allocated by Congress to state DOTs, tribal DOTs, and other groups that apply for it. That's basically what they do. So the Department of Transportation wants to retain as much control over how all of that works. Eligibility requirements, auditing procedures, what happens if a state or in this case a tribe says, oh, we asked you for for 50 million to build that road, but we only used 35. What happens? How do they give the money back? What happens if the project collapses for some reason and they have to give the money back? All of these rules, 113 pages of them, you know, they basically speak to who controls what is going to happen with this money, minute levels of control. And the DOT wanted as much as possible, and that for the tribal negotiators was just a non-starter. Their point was, look, this is tribal self-governance, right? And they stretch back, they educate the DOT leaders. This stretches back to ISDA, Indian Self-Determined Education Assistance. Congress told you to do this, and they told you to fund it, and they told you to negotiate the rule with us, and we're going to stay here until you do that. We're not going to agree to give up control over every aspect of this. So I think that's probably the best answer to the question.
And what was, after a very contentious and confrontational beginning, what was the DOT's response once everything was resolved?
The DOT negotiators, in the end, those very same people who had essentially told us, we were horrible on the very first day and that night, those people were hugging us, they were hugging the tribal negotiators. They remain friends and colleagues to this day. One of them recommended us for a massive FMCS, for another massive government to stakeholder negotiation ongoing right now in the Northwest, in the Columbia River Basin, one of the largest public policy negotiations I've ever seen. And I helped staff that team, but I'm not leading it. It's kind of a crazy one. So they became real believers in, I guess I'll call it mediated negotiated rulemaking. So much so that the Federal Aviation Administration is now looking into conducting its first in many decades noise ordinance review. And this is about jet engines and metropolitan areas, basically. They didn't even begin their internal negotiation without a federal mediation team. So we've got a team working there now. So we happily developed a good reputation at DOT, the whole DOT, through this process. And so we call them friend and colleague. But yeah, at the front end, they were really unhappy about being forced into mediation.
Were there any differences? And by the way, anybody should feel free to jump in or raise their hand. I'm just kind of scrolling through some of the questions that popped up as you were talking. But one of the early questions was whether there's a difference between federally recognized tribes and those who are not federally recognized in terms of access to the negotiating table and to the process.
Yeah, there's a huge difference. And this goes back to the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And I won't go too far into the history there, but that's basically what laid out the current system. It delineated the federal trust responsibility to tribes, and it also allowed for tribes that could prove their history and their connection to a land or an area of the country to apply for federal recognition. So you guys many of you in New York, maybe somebody on Long Island, this actually just happened in the last number of years. There used to be 573, but now the Shinnecock Indians have been federally recognized, and they're 574. Here's how the breakdown, though, and it's interesting. There's only 3 federally recognized tribes in Massachusetts. We also have 2 state recognized tribes, but they're not federally recognized, and that's a whole other process. And yeah, it really, really does matter. With federal recognition, you can gain access to all of the funding, all of the other things federal government supplies tribes under the trust responsibility. You can also look into tribal gaming, which has become a major driver of increasing prosperity, finally, thankfully, for Native America. Not all of Native America, but some areas. Just to give you further breakdown, because it's interesting geographically with, essentially what all the people who came to this country did to the people who are already here in terms of forcing Native Americans west. Out of 574, over 100 of them are in California. Over 200 of them are in Alaska, and many of them prefer to be called Alaska Native. So, obviously there's a large number, in states like Oklahoma and other parts of the country. The Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma has the largest tribal population. I believe it's Navajo that has the largest number of actual acres, but I can't swear to that. There are some tribes which do have large land holdings. Hence the need for road building.
Yeah, and a follow-up on that is, throughout the process, to what extent did the DOT and others involved in the mediation come to understand the history of the treatment of Native Americans and Native Alaskans and the participants, and the meaning of what sovereignty was, and how, if at all, did that impact the process?
Well, at the DOT, there were some much more limited experiments with tribal self-governance, going back all the way to the very late 90s. They had a program called Indian Reservation Roads, and that did morph in, I think, around 06 into a much more limited, what they called tribal transportation program. And so the DOT, on the face of it, they had some negotiators who had done nothing. They were attorneys who had done nothing but work with Native Americans their whole careers in the tribal transportation space. So they had immense respect for tribes, we thought, and they kind of wanted to present as deeply respectful, and also just always come back to the same place, which was to say, well, we're the federal government, so we're going to control this, and we want to do it this way. And it was sort of up to the tribal negotiators to kind of hold off that, that knee-jerk response. And broadly speaking, the federal mediators who practice in this space, we see that a lot of places in federal tribal negotiations. Interestingly, on a project that I did lead in Washington State during the pandemic, 100% Zoom, it was called the Washington Resource Management Plan negotiations, much smaller, 17 tribes, state agencies, federal agencies. The states were, my view only, they were kind of on a more level footing with the tribes, and the feds were sort of up here. And that's a result of, the complicated jurisprudence and history here of how non-natives have dealt with native people in our country. I guess the last point there is, with tribal gaming, there is a lot more money for tribal advocacy, both at the congressional and at the state level. And that's happening everywhere. So what we'll see is tribal advocacy will work on Congress for a particular department. Let's say it's the EPA, I'm making it up. They will demand, and it'll take years, but they'll say, okay, Congress, the next time you do a major piece of EPA legislation, we want you to write into that, whatever it is, it doesn't matter if it's off topic. They'll say, by the way, also write in there that EPA needs to develop its own tribal self-governance program using negotiated rulemaking. So this thing is kind of spreading. So this TTSGP isn't an early example of this, as I showed, but it is one of the largest scale examples of this, which is why it's significant.
And the last question that I have from the chat is leaning a little bit into the tech side, since you conducted this process in a really interesting time as we were switching to hybrid and virtual, and having the plenary in-person sessions. There was a question about what kinds of apps you used, what kinds of programs you used. Did you use Miro as your flip chart creator? Can you speak a little bit about what you found most useful for the tech tools?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you, Nikki, for relaying it. This is going to absolutely floor you when I describe the federal government as an innovator, but we've had electronic flip charting since the year 2000. I started in 2001, and we use there's a vendor, anyone can buy it. It happens to be called Facilitate Pro or facilitatepro.com, and it's a really simple electronic flip charting tool that predated basically all the others that we found out there that have come more recently. Like a Miro or a whiteboard kind of a thing. And it enables you to solicit feedback from everyone in the room with a device or outside the room. It literally just simply lists the line items. You can also convert it, that exact list that comes up from your participants, you can convert it into an instant poll using any kind of thing. And that's going back 23 years. So it was all there for us, and we've been using it ever since. Obviously, now we also have adopted everything else, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, including Teams video conferencing, are our main platforms. We use Miro, we use Poll Everywhere, we use a bunch. I'm not allowed to endorse anything specifically, except to say we're using all the same tools as you guys. I would note here that Washington RMP was 100% virtual. The one I just described, the smaller negotiations, it started in June 1st of 2021, and it wrapped up February 15th. I think it was a Saturday night. That Saturday night, late that night, 2022. And I remember the date because I was working that weekend on it. It was 100% virtual. Plenary featured 175 people on the Zoom meeting from all these tribes and state and federal agencies. When we started that project, the principals there who engaged federal mediation asked me how long it would take. And I said 18 to 24 months. And the use of virtual was, and folks, I've talked about this with friends and colleagues to this day. I'm still astounded. We convened plenary for the first 4 to 5 months of those negotiations. We convened plenary every 2 weeks. 175 people came to negotiate for between 2 to 8 hours. I've never seen it or led anything like it. It was a little bit insane. And all the private caucusing was happening in between. And we didn't take our foot off the gas until I think October or November of that year. But we still needed to convene plenary every several weeks, still needed all those private caucuses. Lots of intertribal negotiation had to happen with mediation assistance, and tribal with the state, with the feds. Anyway, the whole entire thing wrapped up that February. So what's that, 8.5 months later? I mean, I 7.5 months later, I couldn't believe it. They'd been fighting since 2017 on a mediation with a federal judge that failed Christmas Eve 2017. And the deal that they achieved in February 2022 was a 10-year agreement related to endangered species fish. This is about for tribal fishing and other purposes. So virtual works. I can't believe it. I've still never met those people in person. I'm hoping for the day when I have the time to go out there and see if they'll kind of convene in a hotel with me, and just so I can meet them in person. So I think the future, since you asked about tools, the future is going to be hybrid. Columbia River Basin, this one I mentioned that's currently ongoing with federal mediation, is they started 100% virtual, and now they've started weaving in and dialing in various in-person experiences for the group. That sounds about right to me. Last point on this, great question. For work with Native America and in Indian country, the virtual, I think, is preferable. There are all kinds of difficulties with travel for tribal negotiators, not just related to funds for travel, but also to physically where they may be if they live on tribal lands that are remote. A lot of those places have internet service now, even if they don't even have cell phone service via Starlink. That one's for you, Cindy Campbell. And so, the ability to participate in these crucial negotiations has just gone through the roof, and people are. And so, I'm going to favor, and I recommend to the federal mediators I work with leading these things, I recommend that they plan on portions of virtual, even if the group has requested in person. Thanks, Nikki.
Great. I think I'm gonna wrap up my synthesis of the questions now and just thank you again for the really fabulous case study of mediation in practice. It was really wonderful to have your insight and for you to share with us this monumental success. And it's always great to start off the month with a great success story. Maria, I'm going to hand it back over to you for the official thank you. I know some people might have to drop off and there might be some other questions that are coming in late. I don't know, Joshua, if you're able to stay on for 10 or so minutes to answer some stragglers.
Absolutely. I reserved my morning for you guys. I'm so honored to have been invited to this great group. And I'm glad to have joined your listserv as well, which I see is extremely active. So I'll continue to follow along. I love the diversity of opinion on it, actually, and that people don't just automatically agree. Sometimes in the world of conflict management professionals such as yourselves, there's an agreement bias there, but clearly not here. So that's great.
Josh, I have to echo everything Nikki said. You have been absolutely fantastic this morning. It was so refreshing to see how mediation and related processes can be so relevant in these kinds of incredibly complex situations. So thank you so much for your candor, your information, your skill set. It has been a phenomenal morning. And I think you can see that in the chat, everyone thanking you for sharing with us. I guess just one last question, which is always a big one for me these days, is, we talk about the relevance of this field. Have you been able to get word out about your work and how, so that people get to see how relevant mediation and related processes can be? Because as conflict resolvers, many are probably hearing about this work for the first time, and we of all people should know about it. Imagine how little the public knows about these heroic efforts of yours. So are you getting word out through, or are you sort of like mediators who just don't do a whole lot of self-promotion and publicity of what we've done?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Maria. I'll continue if it's okay with the group in my traditionally blunt style and say at FMCS, we're absolutely crap at it. And there's a reason for that. We started out in so there were the labor management peace and service of the war effort in World War II was held for like 5 years because President Roosevelt asked. That's all he did. He asked the leaders of big companies and the leaders of big unions. He said he invited them to the White House just a few days after Pearl Harbor. And he said December 11th, 1941, right? Because labor was really important back then, labor and management. And he invited them in and he asked them for peace to build tanks and planes and weapons and trucks. And as you know, so that broke down at the end of World War II. 3,000 strikes and lockouts in 1945, 3,000 strikes and lockouts in 1946. In the US today, we have like 150 a year. It varies depending on the year. But so the economy was grinding to a halt. Federal mediation was created in that universe. And the idea was the federal mediators, and they, believe it or not, they weren't all white men back in the day, but they were mostly. And so they go riding in on their big white horse to save the day and help everybody get back to work. And that was the way federal mediation felt about itself, right? This kind of unsung heroic role. And the culture of the agency develops from there. And it's taking a really long time to change. But those mediators did receive secret information about how an enterprise was run or how a union was operating in every one of those mediations. And so the mediators are traditionally, the federal mediators are a very tight-lipped group. They just don't like to talk about what they've done. The most they'll say when they complete an important mediation, one that merits attention in the press, from Congress, et cetera, the most they'll say is like nothing. They'll say, yep, I was the mediator. Or they'll say, yeah, I was there. And so I am working with some of my colleagues now in leadership to try and change that in the areas where we can talk about our work, like today. like this, co-authoring articles about these types of cases with Dr. Coleman and others, increasing our academic partnerships. If you have a school that wants to partner with us for any reason, we've got great partnerships with Harvard, MIT, Cornell, et cetera, et cetera. I want partnerships with your local community college. I don't want it just to be the name brand. It's got to be for everybody. So please do send those people my way. And we are also exploring ways of keeping in more regular touch electronically with the American public. Soon you'll see more stuff coming from us. We're really public at our conference. Come in June 2024, New York City. I put it in the chat at the beginning. I'll make sure that the listserv gets the notification when it comes out. For the first time in history, we're combining with the Labor and Employment Relations Association, so it's going to be a giant conference, and it's partially about American industrial labor relations, and it's partially about conflict management and conflict resolution. So much stuff there to learn. New technology tools for mediators coming out of MIT. They're real, they're live. I don't have time to tell you about them today, but those are the kind of people that will come to the conference and run workshops and tell you about new mediation technology.
What a wonderful way to wrap up our morning here with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josh.
We will turn off the official recording. If you could stay on for just a few minutes if there is any informal chat, but we will definitely sign off by 10:15 at the absolute latest. But if anyone wants to ask any questions that have come up since we were on the recording, please raise your hands. Otherwise, we will free Josh to continue with his important work for the United States government.
Maria, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to stay another few minutes. I want to shout out Kira's comment in the chat about humility being both a wonderful trait and a problem. And Kira, that's so beautifully expressed. I think we try to navigate the tension as best we can there. But thank you for that wonderful observation.
I